A high-sided wagon groaned up a frozen farm road at dawn, its axles bowed under a load no one had asked for. At the fence line it stopped, tilted its bed, and spilled 12 tons of wet gray feathers into a steaming heap taller than the top rail. Two young men on the wagon laughed and pointed at the ridge of filth, while the widow at the pump stood motionless, with a bucket going cold in her hand. She did not shout as the empty rig rolled away and left her alone with a mountain of another man's garbage banked against her land. Days later, boots sunk to the ankle in the churned mud of her cattle gate, she felt one narrow strip near the post, refused to give beneath her weight. She crouched, worked a spade under its edge, and pried up a dense slab of packed earth and feather that bent in her hands but would not break. All around it the ground was still soup. A cow could sink to the hock in, and she could not explain why this one band had turned hard. Somewhere beneath that impossible strip lay the answer that might hold her land, if only she could learn to make it happen twice. The wagon came up the Pigeon Run Road a little after 7 in the morning, and Verity Osgood heard it before she saw it. The iron rims grinding against the frozen ruts that the March thaw had not yet softened. She was at the pump with a bucket half filled, and she straightened to watch the team labor around the bend below her fence line. Two big Belgians, steaming in the cold, and behind them a high-sided dumping wagon loaded so heavy the axles bowed. She did not know yet what it carried. She only knew that no one drove a rig that size up her road for any reason that would please her. Because in the 2 years since Harlan had been in the ground, nothing had come up that road but bills, condolences worn thin, and men who wanted something from a widow who had stopped believing that wanting and getting were the same thing. The driver was a man named Rulon Pike, who managed the Feather House down in Ashfield, where they dressed poultry for the market towns and packed the down for bedding, and Verity had spoken to him exactly twice in her life, both times about nothing. He pulled the team up along the low stretch of her fence, where the ground fell away toward the lower pasture, and he did not so much as tip his hat. Two younger men rode the wagon with him, feet dangling off the back, already grinning at each other in the way men grin when they have been let in on a joke that costs them nothing and costs somebody else a great deal. "Got a delivery for you, Mrs. Osgood," Pike called down, a laugh buried under the flatness of it. He did not wait for her to answer. He hauled on the brake lever, threw a lever at the side of the bed, and the whole high box began to tilt on its hinges with a groan of cold metal. What came out was not hay, and was not manure, and was not anything she could name in the first moment. It slid all at once, a wet gray-white avalanche that spilled over the top edge of the sideboards and kept coming. 12 tons of rejected poultry feathers dumped in a single heaving mass against the outside of her fence. Damp clumps of them, matted together, dirty off-white going to gray in the low places, some of it still carrying the sour smell of the dressing floor. The pile rose as it settled, higher than the top rail, spreading along the fence line in a long, soft ridge that steamed faintly in the morning air the way spoiled things do. The two young men on the back of the wagon laughed openly now, one of them pointing at the height of the pile and saying something to the other she could not hear and did not need to. Pike looked at what he had done with the satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem by making it somebody else's. The Feather House had to put the culls somewhere. A widow's fence line, far up a road nobody traveled, was as good as a ravine and cost him nothing in cartage fees to the county tip. "There's more where that came from if you find a use for it," he said, and the joke in it was that no one could find a use for it, that this was the whole point. And the young men laughed again because they understood the joke, and she was meant to understand it too. Then Pike released the brake, clucked to the Belgians, and the wagon rolled empty and light, back down the Pigeon Run Road, and Verity Osgood was left alone at her pump, with a bucket going cold in her hand, and a mountain of somebody else's garbage banked against her land. She did not shout after them. There would have been no dignity in it and no result. She stood a long moment while the wagon noise faded, and she made herself look at the pile instead of at the road, because the road only led to anger, and the pile at least was a fact she would have to live with. 12 tons. It would rot through the spring and draw every fly in the county through the summer, and come the fall, it would still be there. A gray sodden reproach along her western fence, and there would be no one to haul it off, because hauling it off would cost money she did not have. That was the shape of her mornings now. Something arrived, it was hers, and no one was coming to take it away. The farm was 80 acres, most of it decent bottomland along the run, with a rising quarter of pasture to the west. And Harlan had worked it well enough when Harlan was alive. He had died the way careful men sometimes die, all at once and stupidly, a fall from the loft when a rotten board gave under him during the last of the fall haying, and the doctor had come out from Ashfield and done what little there was to do. And by the second morning it was finished. He had left her the land and a girl of 7 who was now a girl of 9. And he had left her something else that Verity did not fully understand until the papers came out of the strongbox, and she sat at the kitchen table reading them by lamplight. A note against the farm, $240 owed to the bank in Ashfield on money Harlan had borrowed to drain the low 40 and put in tile. And the note came due in the fall of the coming year, one full turn of the seasons off. She had counted the months against it more than once, and there were not enough of them, and she knew there were not enough of them, and she counted them anyway. Because counting was a thing she could do with her hands folded. Her daughter was named Etta, and Etta was the whole reason Verity got up before light and stayed up past dark. Because the land under a 9-year-old's feet is not the same as land. It is the difference between a girl who has somewhere to stand and a girl who does not. That morning Etta came out onto the step in her coat, with her hair still in its night braid, drawn by the noise of the wagon, and she stopped and stared at the gray ridge along the fence with her mouth open. "What is it, Mama?" "Feathers. Cull feathers, from the dressing house." "Why did they put them here?" Verity considered how to answer that in a way that would not teach her daughter the wrong lesson about the world, which was that the world would use you if it could find no one to make it stop. "Because they had no other place they cared to put them," she said at last, "and they thought we wouldn't mind." Etta looked at the pile a while longer. "Do we mind? I mind. But minding won't move it. Go on and eat. You've your letters to do." She sent the girl in and stood a moment more. A crow had already come down onto the top of the pile and was walking across it, testing it, finding nothing worth the trouble, and it lifted off again with a complaint. Verity thought the crow had the right idea. There was nothing here worth the trouble, but the pile was not going anywhere on its own. And she had learned in 2 years of widowhood that the things which would not go away on their own had to be turned, somehow, into things she could use, or they would sit on her chest until she could not breathe under the weight of them. Her brother-in-law came up the road 2 days after that, on a Thursday, riding the sorrel gelding that had been his brother's and that he had taken after the funeral without quite asking. Dell Osgood was younger than Harlan had been by 6 years, a smooth-faced man with a way of arranging his concerns so that it always pointed toward whatever he wanted. He drew rein at the gate, looked long at the gray ridge along the fence, and let a low whistle out through his teeth. "Lord, Verity, what did you do to bring that down on yourself?" "Nothing." Pike found a place to put his culls. Dell swung down and looped the reins over the gatepost without being asked in, which was his habit, treating her yard as a place he had standing in. He walked a little way along the fence, looking at the pile with the frank distaste of a man cataloging the reasons another person's life had failed. "It'll draw vermin all summer. It'll stink the house out. You know that." "I know it. You can't leave it." "I'm aware I can't leave it, Dell." He turned and faced her, and now came the part he had ridden up to say, dressed as it always was, in the clothing of a man doing her a kindness. "Verity, I'll say it plain, because somebody in this family ought to. You can't hold this place. You know you can't. The note comes due in the fall and there's no crop yet planted that'll cover a quarter of it, and now you've a mountain of rot against your fence and no man to haul it. There's a fellow in Ashfield, Coggeshall, buys up ground like this. He'd give you a fair price, enough to clear the note and set you and the girl up decent in town. You could work. Etta could go to a proper school. He let that sit, watching her face for the place it would land. There's no shame in knowing when a thing's beyond you. Verity looked at him a while without answering. And what she felt was not anger exactly, though anger was in it. It was the tiredness of hearing a thing said kindly that was meant cruelly, the offer of rescue that was really the offer of surrender. Harlan put tile in that low 40 with borrowed money because he believed this ground was worth borrowing against. She said, I'll not sell it to Coggeshall so he can prove Harlan wrong. Dell's jaw tightened, but he kept the smoothness on. Sentiment won't pay the bank. No, she agreed. It won't. But neither will your Mr. Coggeshall, not what this land's worth. He'd give me enough to clear the note and no more. And I'd walk off the only thing my girl has that's hers. She picked up the empty feed bucket by the gate to give her hands something to do. I'll thank you not to bring Coggeshall's name up this road again. He looked at her the way a man looks at a stubborn animal he intends to outweight, and then he swung back up onto the sorrel that had been his brother's. The season comes whether you want it or not, Verity, he said. And he rode back down the Pigeon Run Road, and she watched him go. And she thought that, of all the things banked against her that spring, the feather pile was the least of them, because at least the feathers had never pretended to be family. She did not touch the pile for the better part of a week. There was too much else, but the rains that came the second week of March turned the whole lower end of the farm to a churning soup. And nowhere worse than the cattle gate at the bottom of the pasture, where the herd crossed twice a day to water, and had already worked the approach into a wallow of deep-sucking mud that pulled the boots off her feet and threatened the cattle's legs every crossing. She stood at that gate one gray afternoon with the muck up over her ankles and thought about the 12 tons of dry material sitting 100 yards off doing nothing but rotting. And a plain notion came to her the way the plainest notions do, unbidden and obvious. Straw would firm a muddy crossing. Wood chips would. She had no straw to spare and no chips at all. But she had feathers by the ton. She carried the first armload down in a grain sack, spreading them across the worst of the gate the way she would have spread bedding, a thick, loose layer over the churned ground, and she stood back, thinking she had at least made a start. The idea failed almost before she finished having it. The herd came down for evening water, and the first cow through drove her hooves straight down through the loose feathers into the mud beneath. And the second and the third did the same. And the feathers did not bind the ground, they greased it. By the time the last of the herd had crossed, the gate was worse than before, slicker and more torn. The feathers mashed into a gray paste that made the footing treacherous where it had only been deep. Verity stood in the last light, looking at the ruin of her good idea, and she felt the particular sourness of a woman who had reached for the obvious answer and been shown. The obvious answer was wrong. She almost let it go at that. It was only when she went to close the gate and swing the latch that her boot came down on a narrow strip of ground tight against the post, and stopped and did not sink. She had not thought anything of it in the moment. She shifted her weight, meaning to step across, and the ground under that one strip held her the way a plank holds, firm and unyielding, where everywhere else her boots had gone into the ankle. She stood still on it. She leaned. It held. She stepped off it into the muck and back onto it, and the difference was so absolute, it was like stepping from a bog onto a floor. Along the post, in a band no wider than her two hands, the churned mud had become something else. She crouched in the failing light and put her fingers to it, and it was not soft. It had a knit to it. She went back up to the barn for the short spade and came down again with the lantern, because she could not let it wait for morning, and she worked the blade in under the edge of the firm strip and pried. She had expected it to crumble the way half-dried mud crumbles. It came up instead in a single dense slab, a wedge of packed earth and feathers locked so thoroughly together that when she stood and held it in both hands and bent it, it flexed but did not break. Feathers ran all through it, flattened and matted into the soil, and the whole of it held as one piece. While not 4 feet away the ground was still soup, a cow sinked to the hock-in. That was the part she could not explain, and it was the part that kept her out at the gate, long after the lantern had begun to gutter. She had spread the same feathers across the whole width of the crossing. She had spread them thicker in other places than here. Everywhere the herd had walked, the feathers had failed. But here along the post, in this one narrow band, they had done the opposite of failing. They had turned the mud into a material. She carried the slab up to the barn and set it on the workbench, and looked at it by lantern light, turning it over. And she did not sleep well that night for turning it over in her mind the same way. Come morning, she was back at the gate, before she had properly eaten, standing over the firm strip, trying to understand what had been different about this one span of ground. Slowly, watching the herd come down for their morning water, she began to see it. The post narrowed the opening. Every animal that crossed was funneled into the same few inches of ground, so that, where the rest of the gate took each hoof once, this strip took hoof after hoof after hoof, the whole weight of the herd driven down, again and again onto the same narrow band. The slab had not been made by one heavy step. It had been made by the same pressure landing, in the same place, over and over, until the feathers and the mud had no choice left but to become one thing. If that was true, then it was not an accident of that one spot. It was a thing that could be done. And if it was a thing that could be done, she needed to know whether she could do it on purpose, somewhere she chose. Before she wasted another sackful learning, she could not. She was not a woman given to hoping out loud, and she did not hope out loud now. She simply began the way she began most things, by testing the smallest version of the idea she could manage. She carried fresh feathers to a bare patch a few feet from the firm strip, spread them in a band the same width, laid a stout plank across the top, and walked her own weight back and forth along the board through the last of the afternoon, trying to press the loose material down the way the herd had pressed it against the post. She worked at it until her legs ached and the light went, and she went in believing she had done something. By morning, the test had failed. The patch under the plank was still soft. Her boot went into it the same as into any other stretch of the muddy lane. And the plank had done nothing but keep the surface flat, while the ground beneath stayed loose. She had put her whole weight on it 100 times, and her whole weight, it turned out, was not the thing that mattered. So she tried more of it, and harder. She spread a fresh strip and this time brought the cattle to it, guiding 4 of the gentler cows across the same narrow band again and again, using the animals to lay down the kind of load that had built the slab by the post. This came nearer. By evening, one corner of the strip had firmed under her boot, gone tight and unyielding the way the original had, but only the corner. The rest stayed soft, and no matter how she worked the cattle back across it, she could not get the whole band to take. She had proven the feathers would pack tighter than she had believed. She had not yet learned to make them do it evenly, on ground she chose, at a time she chose, and until she could do that, she had a curiosity and not a use. She went back to the post and stood a long while watching the herd funnel through, and the answer, when it came, was almost too plain to trust. The slab had not been made by great force. It had been made by the same middling force arriving in the same spot, without let-up, hour on hour, day on day. It was not the size of the pressure. It was the sameness of it, the way it never moved and never eased. She could not stand at a gate, ordering cattle across one strip for a week. But she did not have to. She could hold the pressure in place herself and let time do the walking. Behind the barn was a heap of old fence boards. Harlan had never gotten around to burning. And beside them, a low stack of field stones she had pulled out of the garden, 2 springs running, flat gray slabs of it, heavier than she liked to lift. She built a crude press out of what she had, needing nothing she would have to buy and nothing she would have to build. She laid down a bedboard, spread a thick, even layer of cleaned feathers across it, wet them down from the trough to match the damp of the ground at the gate, laid a second board across the top, and stacked the fieldstone onto the upper board, slab after slab, until the whole weight of it bore down on the feathers between, and she could barely have lifted the top stone back off. Then she left it. Overnight, and the next day, and the next night, the stones holding their pressure in the same place without pause, doing with patience what the herd had done with numbers. The third morning, she pulled the stones off one at a time and lifted the top board, and the loose gray pile had become a single flat, dense piece, tight enough that it held its shape when she took it up by one edge, and it did not sag. She had made it. She had made it on purpose, in a spot she chose, and she stood in the barn holding it up to the light through the door, with something in her chest she had not let herself feel in a good while, which was the feeling of having asked the world a question and gotten an answer that was not no. She carried it down to the gate that same morning to try it against the mud that had beaten her. She laid it over the softest span of the crossing, and it held under her boots without giving, and when she rolled the little handcart across it, loaded with a sack of feed, the wheels tracked over the top, and the piece barely stirred. For the length of that morning, she believed she had solved the thing entire. The gate would firm. The cattle would cross dry. Whatever else came, she would have wrung one usable thing out of the mountain Pike had dumped on her, which was more than Pike had believed any woman could do. Then the herd came down for their evening water, and they came the way cattle come, not straight and not careful, but crowding and turning, and the hooves struck the piece from every angle at once. A cow put her full weight on one edge, and the piece tipped. Another came down half on and half off, and the corner folded under. Within a dozen crossings, the slab that had held her cart and her boots had been shoved sideways, buckled, worked half under the mud, and torn clean across the middle where the herd had wrenched it two ways at once. By the time the last cow had gone through, the crossing was mud again, and the piece she had spent 3 days and all her cleverness to make was a ruined gray rag trodden into the muck. She stood over the wreck of it in the dusk, and she did not curse, though there was cursing in her. She had learned something even in the failure, though she could not yet say what. The material was strong. It was strong against a steady weight, against her cart, against her own boots pressing down. It was not strong against this, against the wrenching sideways violence of a herd turning through a gate, the twisting and the folding and the tearing at angles. She had built a thing that would bear a load and would not bear an animal. And she went up to the house that night, knowing she had proven the feathers could be made into something, and knowing, with equal plainness, that the something was not this. She had answered one question and been handed a harder one in its place, which was the way of every true thing she had ever learned, and she banked the fire and looked in on Etta sleeping, and lay awake a long time with the ruined slab turning behind her eyes, because she could not yet see what it was good for, only that it was good for something, and that the something was hiding from her in plain sight, the way the firm strip by the post had hidden all that first week she walked past it. Morning found her back at the gate before she had meant to be, gathering up what the herd had torn apart, salvaging the pieces not beaten past use. Most of the press material was ruined outright, mashed into the hoof-pocked mud so thoroughly she could not tell where the slab ended and the crossing began. But one chunk of it, a piece the size of a hearthstone, had been kicked clear of the traffic entirely, flung off to the side by a cow's hoof, and come to rest flat on a bare slope of ground just beyond the fence. A stretch of open dirt that fell away toward the run and that nothing walked across because there was no reason to. She almost left it there. It was only one piece, and it had failed her along with the rest. She carried the salvage up to the barn and did not think about that one clear chunk again until the weather thought about it for her. A hard rain came through that night, the kind of straight heavy spring rain that runs off faster than the ground can drink. And Verity lay in the dark, listening to it drum the roof and hammer the yard, and thought of nothing but whether the run would come up over its banks. In the morning, the yard was cut, with little runnels where the water had found its paths. The bare slope below the gate, scored with fresh, shallow gullies, where the rain had carried the topsoil down toward the water. She walked the fence to see what the storm had done, and she came to the chunk of pressed feather still lying where the cow had flung it, and she stopped. The rain had cut a shallow groove through the exposed dirt all around it. Everywhere the open slope had been bare, the water had bitten in and carried the soil away in thin brown fans. But directly beneath the chunk, where the pressed piece covered the ground, the dirt was flat and whole and untouched, held in place under the mat of matted feather while the storm cut the earth away on every side of it. The piece that had been useless under the cattle, that had torn apart the moment a hoof twisted across it, had done something else entirely, lying here where nothing could step on it. It had not needed to bear a load. It had needed only to lie still against the ground and keep the rain from carrying the ground away, and at that, it had not failed at all. She stood over it a long moment while the thing turned itself over in her mind and came up the other way round. She had been asking the feathers to do the wrong work. She had been trying to make a floor of them, a thing to be walked on, and they were not a floor. They were a skin. They were a cover to hold the ground down against the one force that took more from a farm than any hoof ever had, which was water running downhill across bare dirt, carrying the topsoil off a slope a handful at a time until the slope was gravel and stone and would grow nothing. Harlan had lost the whole east bank of the run that way. The year before he died, a good stand of ground gone to gullies after a wet spring, and there had been nothing to do but watch. She had watched it with him. Now here in her two hands was a thing that had held its patch of dirt through a storm that had cut the ground open all around it. She did not let herself run ahead of the fact. One chunk, one storm, one square of dirt the size of a hearthstone. It proved almost nothing. But it pointed, and she had learned to follow the things that pointed even when they pointed at a great deal of work. She carried the one whole piece she had left, the other salvaged from the ruin at the gate, to a bare-washed patch farther across the property where the rain already cut the soil worst, a raw slope above the run that lost ground every wet season. She laid the piece across the slope, pinned the edges down with stones, so the cattle could not reach it, and the wind could not lift it, and left it there through the next stretch of weather with the herd shut out of it entirely. Because she understood now that the cattle were not the test. The water was the test. After the next storm, most of the piece was still holding, the ground beneath it flat, while the slope on either side had begun to channel. But one edge had lifted, just enough where she had not weighted it firmly, and the water had gotten in under the raised lip and begun to peel the material back and carve the dirt beneath it, undoing at that one corner all the good the rest of it had done. She went out in the wet and pressed the edge back down and set a heavier stone on it, knowing the repair was a patch on a patch and would not hold forever. And she stood on the slope in the drizzle with her skirt soaked to the knee and understood two things at once. The first was that the material worked. The second was that she had made, in all her days of pressing between boards and stones, exactly two pieces whole enough to use, and that against 12 tons of loose feathers banked along her fence, 2 pieces was nothing, was a thimbleful dipped out of a flood, and that if this was going to be anything more than a curiosity she had proven to herself alone, she would have to make the material faster than one slow slab at a time. And she did not yet have the first idea how a woman alone was to do that. She turned the problem over through the milking and through the evening chores and through the washing up. And she came at it the way she came at everything now, by asking not what she wished were true, but what was already true and near to hand. She could not press 12 tons between 2 boards. She would be an old woman before she finished, and the feathers would rot to slime long before she got to the bottom of the pile. But the pressing was only a way of getting the feathers to knit, to lock together into a single sheet instead of lying loose. And she was not the only person in the county who made loose fiber knit into sheet. Up on Cobb Creek, 4 miles north where the water ran fast enough to turn a wheel, Anson Ferris ran a small carding and fulling mill, took in the neighborhood's wool clip and carded it, and ran it through his machines and sent it back as batting and cloth, and what his mill did to wool, with teeth and rollers and hot water and pressure, was not so far from what her boards and stones had done to the feathers, only faster and evener, and by the wellful instead of the handful. She did not know if it would work, Feathers were not wool. But she had learned that spring that not knowing was a poor reason to leave a thing untried, and she began, that same evening, to sort. She dragged a length of old canvas out flat behind the barn, and went to the pile with a fork, pulling the usable feathers from the wreck of it, the ones that had not yet gone to rot, picking out the sticks and the quills and the clots of filth. And she rinsed the sorted feathers in the trough water until they came clean and spread them across the canvas to dry in whatever sun the changeable spring would give her. It was slow, filthy, stinking work, and her hands cracked with the wet and the cold. And Etta came out and worked beside her some of it, small fingers picking debris from the drying feathers, while Verity forked more from the pile, the two of them not talking much, but the work going easier for the company. Bit by bit, a clean batch grew on the canvas, gray-white and dry and light as the thing it was, and Verity looked at it drying in the thin sun and thought that whatever else it was no longer garbage. Garbage was what Pike had dumped along her fence. This she had made into something with a use waiting inside it, and all that stood between her and finding out was 4 miles of creek road, and whatever Anson Ferris would say when a widow came to his mill door with a wagon bed full of poultry feathers and asked him to run them through machines built for wool. She loaded the dried feathers into grain sacks the following week, filled the wagon bed with them light and high, and hitched the old mare in the gray of the morning. Before she climbed up, she went back once to the gate and stood over the firm strip by the post, the first slab, the one the herd had made without meaning to, still holding there against the mud after everything. And she looked at it the way a person looks at the place a thing began. Then she took up the reins and turned the mare down the Pigeon Run road toward Cobb Creek, past the long gray ridge of the pile that was smaller now, by the sacks she had taken, but still ran the length of her fence, still enough to bury a lesser resolve, and she did not look at it as a burden anymore. She looked at it as material she had not yet learned the whole use of, and she drove north into the cold, bright morning with the wagon creaking under a load that 2 weeks before she would have paid a man to haul away, and that she would not now have traded for the coin it would have cost her. The mill sat where the Cobb Creek Road dropped down to the water, a squat frame building with a wheel turning slow on its flank and a smell of wet wool and lanolin hanging over the whole yard. Anson Ferris came out to meet the wagon before. Verity had the mare tied, a lean man of middle years with wool lint caught in the gray of his beard and forearms corded from a life of wrestling batting through rollers. And he looked at the grain sacks heaped light and high in the bed with the particular curiosity of a man whose trade was fiber and who had never in his years seen this fiber come to his door. Osgood's widow, he said, placing her without unkindness, and he came to the wagon and pulled the neck of the nearest sack open with 2 fingers. When he saw what was inside, his brows drew down, not in refusal, but in the frank puzzlement of a craftsman, handed a thing outside his knowing. Feathers, cleaned and dried, culls from the Ashfield dressing house. Pike dumped 12 ton on my fence line, and I found a use for a little of it, if your machines will take it. Ferris pulled a pinch of the down out and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger the way she had watched him roll wool, feeling the length of it, the crimp it did not have. This isn't wool. It's got no scale on it, no lock. Wool felts because the fibers grab one another when you work them wet and warm. Feather won't grab. Run this through my fulling stocks alone, and you'll get wet feathers out the far end, same as went in, only angrier. He said it plainly, a man stating the limits of his craft, rather than turning away trade. Whatever held your slab together at that gate, it wasn't the feather learning to felt. It was the mud packed through it. That stopped her, because it was true, and she had not thought it through so far. The slab by the post had been mud and feather locked as one. The mud had been half the material. She stood in the mill yard with the water, sheeting off the wheel behind her, and felt the whole notion tilt under her. Because she could not carry mud to a fulling mill, and mud was not a thing she could sell rolled up in a wagon. Then it won't knit at all, she said, and she heard the flatness come into her own voice, the sound of a door closing that she had driven 4 miles to open. Ferris did not answer straight away. He was still rolling the feather between his fingers, his eyes gone somewhere past her, into the machinery of his own trade. And she recognized the look, because she wore it herself over the pressing boards. "I didn't say it won't knit," he said slowly. "I said feather won't knit to feather. But wool will knit to anything you card into it. If I blended this down through a batch of wool, carded the two together so the feather rode inside the lock of the wool would do the grabbing and carry the feather along with it." He looked back at her. "You'd have a sheet that was part feather, part wool. More body than wool alone. Cheaper than wool alone, because the feather cost you nothing but the hauling. Whether it'd hold together under weather, I couldn't tell you. Nobody's had cause to try it, because nobody before had 12 ton of feather sitting free on a fence." The door that had closed came open again, narrower, into a room she had not expected. She did not have wool. She had a house cow's worth of nothing, and a note coming due, and Ferris's wool was Ferris's to sell. "I've no wool to cart it with, and no money to buy yours." Ferris considered that, and considered her, and considered the 12 tons she had described the way. A millman considers a supply of raw stock that has cost its owner nothing. "I've fleece here folks brought to be worked that they've not come back to claim. Coarse stuff, britch wool, the kind that goes for carpet yarn, and not much else, sits in my loft going to moth. I'll cart a batch of your feather through some of that and run it, and we'll see what comes off the stocks. You'll owe me for the working, not the wool." He named a figure that was less than she had feared and more than she had, and then, before she could speak, he named the other way. "Or you bring me butter and eggs against it through the summer, and a day's help at the wash when the spring clip comes in heavy, and we'll call the working square. I'd sooner have a neighbor owing me labor than the bank owing me nothing." She took the second way, because the second way she could pay, and they struck it there in the yard, with no paper between them but a handshake, her cracked hand in his lint-dusted one, and she drove home lighter than she had come, though the wagon was empty, because for the first time since the pile came down, she was not the only one who believed there was something in it. The carting took the better part of a day. She came back to watch. Ferris fed the blended stock into the swift, and the feather and the coarse wool went in together, and came off the doffer as a single continuous bat. Gray shot through with the off-white of the down, wider and more even than anything her boards had ever made. Then it went to the fulling stocks, the great wooden hammers, rising and falling in their troughs, pounding the wetted bat with hot water sluiced from the boiler, and Verity stood over the trough, breathing the wet wool steam, and watched the loose blend draw in on itself, tighten, thicken, the wool locking down around the feather, exactly as Ferris had said it would. Hammerstroke after hammerstroke doing with iron regularity what the herd had done at the gate and her stones had done in the barn. The same lesson written a third time, in a third place, that it was not the force, but the sameness of the force that made loose things into one thing. What came off the stocks and went over the drying rack was a dense felted sheet, gray and even, and strong, that she could pull several feet of across the mill floor and work the edge of between her hands without it giving, wider than her arm span and longer than her wagon and uniform end to end, in a way her hearthstone slabs had never been. She stood with the length of it running through her hands and felt the size of the thing change under her. She had been thinking in hearthstones. This was bolt goods. This was material by the running yard, made as fast as the wheel would turn. And there was suddenly no reason she could see that 12 tons of feather could not become more of it than she had slope to cover. But covering her own slopes was not a use that would pay a note. It would save her ground and cost her the working, and put nothing in the strongbox against the fall, and she carried that hard fact home with the first roll in the wagon bed. She had made a material. She had not yet made a single dime, and a material that only saved her own dirt was a material she could not afford to make. Ferris, as it happened, was the one who turned that corner for her, though he did not know he was doing it. She came back for the second roll a week on, And while he loaded it, he mentioned, in the way a man mentions weather, that a farmer down the Salt Fork way named Hollis Trap had been by asking whether the mill made anything a body could lay over a raw ditch bank to hold it, because Trap had a drainage cut along his field road that took a wider bite out of his ground every hard rain, and a man had come out and priced him a job of stone riprap to armor it, and the price had been more than Trap cared to sink into a stretch of ditch that grew him nothing. I told him I make cloth and batting and not ditch armor, Ferris said, settling the roll into her wagon, but that maybe the widow Osgood had a thing that might answer, if she'd a mind to drive down and look at it. He straightened and gave her a level look. I'll not push you at it, but you asked me once what your material was good for past your own slopes. And there's a man 4 miles south who'll pay money not to watch his road wash into his corn. She drove down the Salt Fork Road 2 days later, the roll of feather felt in the wagon behind her and a coil of cut stakes beside it, and she found Hollis Trap's ditch the way Ferris had described it and worse. It ran alongside the field road for better than 100 yards, a drainage cut meant to carry the runoff from the higher ground off toward the creek, and every hard rain of the last several years had cut it deeper and wider. The banks caved in raw and bare, old washouts undercutting the road shoulder, and at the upper end a wooden culvert ran under a farm crossing and spilled its whole gathered flow out onto the bank below. Trap himself was a heavy-set man past 50, with a suspicion of new things worn into his face like weather into a post, and he looked at the roll in her wagon and at her, and made no attempt to hide what he thought of both. Ferris said you had something. I didn't rightly figure it'd be feathers. He said the word, the way Pike had said it, as if it were the punchline to a thing, and Verity felt the old familiar heat come up the back of her neck and pushed it down, because she had learned by now that heat proved nothing to a man like this and only work would. It's feather and wool, felted, she said. I'll not tell you it'll hold, because I don't know that it will on a run of water this size. I know it held my own slope through storms that cut the ground open on both sides of it. You've a bank that's already lost, Mr. Trap. I'm asking you to let me cover one bad stretch of it and let the next hard rain be the judge. If it fails, you've lost a piece of ditch that was failing anyway, and the price of nothing, because I'll not charge you for a trial that doesn't hold. Trap chewed on that. It was the last part that turned him, she thought, the offer to carry the risk herself, because a man who has been quoted a dear price for stone is disarmed by a body who offers to try for free. One stretch, he said. The worst of it, down there below the crossing where it's cut the deepest. You cover that, and if it holds a real rain, we'll talk about the rest. If it don't, you take your feathers and we're square, and I've lost nothing but an afternoon watching. She took the worst stretch, which was what she had wanted anyway, because a thing proven on the worst ground was proven for good. She unrolled the felt down the length of the cut bank, laid it so it lapped up over the shoulder and down into the throat of the ditch, and she drove her stakes through it into the firm soil. At the edges, close set along the top, where the water would try hardest to peel it and loose her down the face, pinning the whole sheet flat against the raw bank. It went fast. What had taken her the better part of a day to cover, with hand-pressed pieces at home, now went under a continuous sheet in less than half an hour, one length lapping the next, staked and snug, the bare wounded bank disappearing under a skin of gray, felt from the crossing down to where the ditch bent away. Trap watched the whole of it from the road with his arms folded, saying nothing, but she noticed he did not go back to his barn. And a man who stays to watch is a man who has begun, against his own will, to want to see. A light rain came through that night and did nothing, which was no test at all. And she said as much to Etta over the breakfast table, that a light rain proved a thing could get wet and not that it could hold. The real test came 4 days later and came hard. It began at dusk with the low iron sky she had learned to read and settled in to stay. A straight soaking downpour that filled every ditch in the county and kept filling them through the night. The runoff pouring off the higher fields and gathering into the cuts and driving the culverts full. Verity lay awake in her own house, 4 miles off, listening to it hammer the roof, and thought of the felt staked down on Trap's bank, taking the full weight of a real storm's runoff. And there was nothing she could do but lie there and let the night decide it. And she found she could not sleep for the wanting to know. She drove down at first light through a world scoured and dripping, the roads cut with fresh runnels, and she came up the Salt Fork Road, not knowing whether she would find her material lying snug against the bank or torn off and gone downstream. And what she found was both. Most of the stretch had held. Down the long run of the cut where the water had spread and slowed, the felt lay flat and dark and sodden against the bank exactly as she had staked it. The raw soil beneath it whole, not a spoonful of it carried off. While on the untreated bank across the ditch, the storm had cut fresh brown channels down the bare face. It had worked. Along most of its length, it had done precisely the thing she had built it to do. But at the upper end, directly below the wooden culvert, it had not held at all. There the felt had been peeled loose and shoved bodily downstream. Wadded and torn and hung up in a snag, 10 feet below where she had staked it and where it had been there, was now a fresh raw gouge cut into the bank, deeper than the storm had cut anywhere else. The soil scoured down to the pale subsoil in a widening scar. She climbed down into the wet ditch and picked up the torn end of the displaced felt and followed the damage back up toward its source. And the closer she came to the mouth of the culvert, the deeper the cut ran, until she was standing directly below the wooden pipe with water still running out of it, diminished, now but steady, driving down onto the exact patch of bank where everything had torn away. She crouched there in the running ditch with the cold water over her boots and made herself look at it instead of away from it, because the failure was trying to tell her something. And she had learned that failures, which tore things apart, had more to teach than successes that held. Every torn edge, when she traced it, led back to this one spot below the pipe. The long spread runs of the ditch where the water came at the felt broad and slow, the material had turned aside without trouble. It was only here, where the culvert gathered all the runoff off of the upper field into one throat and spat it out in a single hard, concentrated stream, that the felt had been overpowered. The whole storm had not beaten her material. One point had. The pipe took the diffuse weight of the whole hillside's range and focused it down into a battering column of water aimed at one pat ground, and no skin she could lay over that patch would hold. Because the problem there was not the bank washing, it was the water arriving with the force of a driven fist at a single spot before it ever reached the ground she had covered. Trap had come down from the house and stood at the lip of the ditch above her, looking at the long-held run of felt and then at the torn scar below the pipe, and there was something in his face that had not been there the day she staked it. A grudging recalibration. A man revising downward his certainty that this was foolishness. Held most of it, he allowed, which from him she understood to be a great concession. Tore out under the pipe. The pipe's the whole trouble, she said, straightening in the water. It's not the bank that failed. It's that everything the pipe carries comes down on one place hard enough to knock a mule off its feet. Cover it or don't cover it, that spot tears out, because the water's doing all its work in the first 3 feet past the mouth. She wiped the wet off her face with the back of a filthy hand and looked at the scoured gouge. And the answer to it was already forming. Because if the trouble was that the water arrived all in one hard column, then the thing to do was not to armor the ground against the column, but to break the column before it ever landed. "You've fieldstone about this place?" He had, a heap of it picked out of his own fields and dumped at the fence corner the way every farmer's stone got dumped. And it was that heap she was thinking of. She had Trap bring a stone boat down to the ditch, and the two of them worked through the middle of the day hauling fieldstone to the mouth of the culvert. And she built below the pipe a rough apron of it, a spread of rough, uneven stone laid out across the spot where the water landed, so that the driven column coming out of the pipe would strike rock and not soil, would break apart on the uneven faces of the stone and lose its force scattering among them. And only then spent and divided into smaller harmless runnels, would it reach the fresh length of felt she staked just below the stone. The stones were rough, and they sat crooked, and nothing about it looked like the neat quoted riprap the other man had priced. But it did the one thing that mattered, which was to take the single hard stream and shatter it into a dozen soft ones before it could touch the ground she meant to save. Nothing about it was proven. The rock sat where the last storm had done its worst, and only the next hard rain would tell whether breaking the water before it landed was enough, or whether she had only moved the point of failure a few feet down, and would come back to find her stones scattered, and her fresh felt gone the way of the first. "You've built me a rock pile in a patch, and told me yourself neither one's proven," Trap said, standing over the rough apron with his hands on his hips. And there was doubt in it, but there was no longer scorn, and the difference was the whole of what she had earned that day. "I'll grant you it held where the water behaved. It's the places water don't behave that a body pays to fix. Then let the water that don't behave be the judge of it, same as before. It costs you nothing to wait for the next rain." It did not cost him nothing, though, and she knew it did not. And driving home, she turned over the things she had not said to Trap, which was that it was costing her a great deal. Every trial she gave away free was a roll of felt she had paid Ferris in butter and labor to make. And every day she spent staking another man's ditch was a day she did not spend on her own place or on the endless work of sorting and cleaning the pile. And the note in the strongbox did not care how many banks she saved for other men if she saved them for free. She had proven the material worked. She had proven she could make it by the roll. She had not yet turned a yard of it into a coin. And the season was turning under her while she gave her cleverness away to skeptics, a stretch of ditch at a time. Dell was waiting at her gate when she came up the Pigeon Run Road. In the last of the light, the sorrel tied and cropping her grass, and she knew before she was down off the wagon that he had not ridden out for the pleasure of her company. He had a way of standing in her yard as though he were already assessing it for another owner, and tonight there was a briskness to him. A man come with news he was pleased to carry. "You've been driving all over the county with a wagon of feathers, they tell me," he said, the amusement in it thin over something harder. "Down to Trap's, staking his ditch. Verity, folks are laughing. You know that. A widow woman hauling poultry culls up and down the roads, playing at ditch mending while her own note comes due." He shook his head with a show of sorrow that did not reach his eyes. "I've held my tongue on it because you're family, but I'll not hold it any longer, because I've done something about it, and I'd have you hear it from me before you hear it in town." She stood very still by the wagon wheel. "What have you done, Dell?" "I brought Coggeshall out to see the place." He said it plainly now, the softness gone, a man laying a card he had been holding. "Rode him out 3 days back while you were off down the Salt Fork. Walked him over the bottomland and the pasture. He's willing, Verity. He'll clear the whole note and give you 200 over it besides, cash in hand, enough to take a decent house in Ashfield and keep you and the girl a year while you find your feet. He wants your answer before the note falls due, because after it falls due, he'll not need to offer you anything at all. The bank'll have it, and he'll buy it off the bank for the debt, and you'll walk off with nothing." He let that land, and then he softened his voice again, which was worse than the hardness. "I'm trying to save you something out of this. There's a kindness in a clean sale that there's none in a foreclosure. Take the offer while it's an offer." She looked at her brother-in-law, standing in her dead husband's yard, with another man's money in his mouth, and she understood at last that he had never meant to help her hold the place, that from the first he had meant her to lose it, that the concern he wore was the concern of a man steering a stubborn animal toward the chute it did not want to enter, and that he had walked a buyer over Harlan's ground behind her back, while she was 4 miles off, trying to save another man's dirt. She thought of the felt lying staked and holding on Trap's bank, of the rough stone apron waiting for the next rain, of the materials she had wrung out of the garbage they had dumped to shame her. And she thought that it was a poor thin thing to set against a note of $240 and a buyer with cash in his hand, and a brother-in-law working the far side against her. "You walked a stranger over my land without my leave," she said, and her voice came out quiet, which was how it came out when she was past the reach of shouting. "While I was away, and you call it kindness, I call it sense." Some of the smoothness cracked. "There's no crop in the ground, Verity. There's no money coming. There's a rotting mountain on your fence, and a pile of wet felt you can't sell, and you've got till the fall. You can hand this place over clean and walk away with something, or you can hold on to your pride and hand it over dirty and walk away with nothing but the girl's hand in yours and no roof to take her under. That's the whole choice. Everything else is you telling yourself a story. Get on your horse, Dell." She did not raise her voice. "That's my brother's horse you rode out here, and my brother's land you walked a buyer over, and I'll thank you to take the one off the other and go." He looked at her a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face told him there was no moving her tonight, and he was too careful a man to spend his welcome all at once. "The offer holds till the note falls," he said, swinging up onto the sorrel. "Coggeshall's a patient man. He can wait because time's on his side and not yours. Think on the girl, Verity, if you won't think on yourself." Then he rode down the road, into the dark, and she stood in her yard with her hands cold and her mind colder, because the thing he had said that stuck was not the threat and not the money. It was the girl's hand in yours and no roof to take her under, and she stood there in the dark a long while after the hoofbeats had gone. Because he had found, in the whole armory of things he might have said, the one that could reach her. She did not tell Etta any of it. She made supper and heard the girl's letters, and banked the fire. And when Etta was asleep, she took the lamp out to the barn and stood over the first slab on the workbench, the muddy knit piece from the gate, and beside it, the clean, even scrap of the mill felt. The two side by side, the whole distance she had come in a season, laid out in two pieces of matter no bigger than her two hands. One was mud and accident. The other was cloth and intention. Neither one, she thought, was worth a dime until somebody paid her for it, and nobody had, and the man who wanted her ruined had a buyer walking her land behind her back. The days after ran short and hard. She kept her bargain with Ferris, carried butter and eggs up the Cobb Creek Road, and gave her day at the wash when the spring clip came heavy, standing to her elbows in hot lanolin water sorting fleece while the mill roared, and in the between times she sorted and cleaned more of the pile. Because the pile was the only capital she had, and a cleaned pile was worth more than a rotting one. But the note sat in the strongbox like a stone in her own chest, and every roll of felt she made was a roll she had not sold. And she began to understand that proving a thing worked was not the same as making it pay, and that she might yet lose the farm not because her material failed, but because she could not turn it to money fast enough to matter. Then the rain that would judge the stone apron came in the last week of the month, and it came harder than the storm before it. She woke in the black of the early morning to the sound of it, and lay listening to it come down in sheets, heavier than the storm that had torn out Trapp's bank below the pipe. And she thought of the rough, uneven apron she had built, with her own hands, to break the water before it landed. Sitting down there in the dark, taking a worse beating than the one that had beaten her first attempt, and she got up before light and hitched the mare in the pouring dark because she could not bear to wait for the roads to dry, and she drove down the Salt Fork Road through a storm, still spitting its last, with her heart going hard against the not knowing. The ditch was running full when she came to it, brown water moving fast down the whole length of the cut, and she left the mare at the road and went down the bank on foot through the wet grass to the mouth of the culvert to see what the night had done to her stone. Several of the stones had shifted. She could see that at once the apron rearranged. One or two of the larger pieces rolled a foot down from where she had set them, settled into new places by the force of the water. But the apron was still there. It had not scattered. It had shifted and settled and found its own seat, the rough stones wedging tighter against one another as the water worked them. And below the mouth of the pipe, The driven column was striking rock exactly as she had meant it to, breaking apart white across the uneven faces, spreading and slowing before it ever reached the fresh length of felt she had staked below. And the felt below the stone was holding. It was scuffed and filthy and half buried in the silt the storm had carried down, but it was anchored where she had staked it, and beneath it the bank was whole. No fresh gouge cut through the soil. The scar the first storm had torn now covered and held against a rain worse than the one that had made it. She stood in the streaming ditch in the gray dawn light, with the rain still fine on her face, and let herself feel for one moment only the full size of what the held stone meant. Because she had built it not knowing, and it had held knowing. And there was a thing in that worth more to her just then than the money it might someday make. She had taken the point where the water did its worst, the exact spot that had beaten her, and she had beaten it back, not with the dear stone riprap a hired man would have quoted, but with a farmer's own field-picked rock laid rough by a widow's hands. And it had held a storm that had no business being held. Trap came down through the rain in his oilcloth as the light came up, and he stood at the lip of ditch and looked, a long time, at the shifted but holding apron, and the scuffed but anchored felt, and the whole bank of it whole, where the storm before had gouged it out, and then he walked the length of the long run, to where the felt had held from the first, and then across to the untreated bank, where the fresh storm had cut new grooves down the bare face and carried the loose soil off, downstream in the running water, and he came back to where she stood and did not say anything for a while. When he did, it was not to her exactly, it was more to the ditch, to the thing itself, a man saying aloud a conclusion he had fought. "I'll be damned. The rock broke it. Where you put the rock, it broke the water, and where the water broke, your feathers held." He turned and looked at her full on, and the last of the scorn was gone out of his face, replaced by the thing she had been working the whole spring to earn, which was a hard man's reluctant respect. "I priced a stone job on this ditch would have cost me $40, and a week of a hired crew's time. You did the worst of it with my own rock and a wagon of garbage in a morning." He shook his head at the ditch, at the felt, at the whole unlikely fact of it. "What do you want for the rest of it? The whole run, top to bottom, done proper the way you done this." It was the first time anyone had asked her what she wanted for it, and she felt the question change the ground under her feet more surely than any storm had. She named a price. She had worked it out on the drive down through 100 sleepless calculations, the cost of the working she owed Ferris and the stakes, and her own days, with enough over it that the doing would leave her ahead and not merely even. And she named it steady, watching his face, ready for him to balk. He did not balk. He was a man who had just watched $40 of stone work, done in a morning for a fraction of it. And the price she named was a bargain against what he had been quoted, and he put out his wet hand and she took it. And there in the streaming ditch in the gray light, after the storm, Verity Osgood sold the first yard of material she had made out of the mountain that was meant to shame her. She drove home that morning with an order in her pocket, and the rain gone off to nothing behind her. And for the length of the drive, she let herself believe the corner was turned. But she was a careful woman, and did not stay long in the believing, because an order from Trap was one order from one man, and one order would not clear a note of $240. And Dell's buyer was still out there patient as a spider, with the season coming on his side of the scale. One held ditch was not a business, it was a beginning. And a beginning was a fragile thing to set against a debt and a brother-in-law and a buyer with cash in his hand, and she knew. Driving up the Pigeon Run road toward the long gray ridge that was smaller now, but still ran her fence, that Trap's order would have to become the first of many, and fast, before the season turned all the way over, or it would be nothing more than the proof that she had found the answer just too late to save the ground the answer was meant to save. The order from Trap took her the better part of a week to fill, and she filled it in the changeable weather of a late spring that could not decide whether to be done with rain driving the Salt Fork Road with roll after roll of the felt in the wagon bed, unrolling the whole run of his ditch from the crossing down to the bend, lapping and staking each length the way she had learned to do it, setting a smaller rough apron of his own fieldstone below every place where a side drain or a low spot funneled the water into a harder stream. She worked from first light to last, and Trap worked beside her more than she had expected a man of his temper to, hauling stone on his boat and driving stakes where she pointed. A man who had decided thing was worth doing and did not do it by halves once he had decided. When the last length was staked and the last apron seated, the whole 100 yards of his ruined ditch lay under a continuous skin of gray, felt broken only by the rough stone at the hard points. And he walked the length of it twice, and then he paid her, counting the coins into her hand in the sunlight at the road. And it was the first money the mountain had ever made her, and she folded it away against the note with a care that had nothing to do with its amount. But it was what came the week after that she had not planned for and could not have planned for, because it walked onto Trap's place on its own legs while she was miles away at her own. The man who had priced Trap the stone job in the first place, an excavation and drainage contractor named Amos Kettle, who worked the whole of Tolliver County and half the next one dredging ditches and laying tile and armoring the cuts that farmers could not armor themselves, came back down the Salt Fork Road on a matter of his own and passed the ditch he had quoted. And he saw it. He saw 100 yards of raw wounded bank that he had priced at a week of his crew's labor, and a wagon load of quarried stone lying quiet and whole under a gray skin he had never seen in his life, holding where his own trade said it should be washing. He stopped his rig in the road. He got down. He walked it. Trap told her the whole of it after, how Kettle had come to the house asking what in creation was laid on that ditch and who had laid it, how he had walked the run slow with his hands behind his back, the way a man walks a thing he means to understand and not merely look at, how he had crouched at the culvert mouth and studied the rough apron a long time, pressing his boot against the felt below it, working his fingers down into the seam where the stone met the material. He had crossed to the untreated bank and looked at the fresh cuts the last storm had left there, the bare soil channeled and carried off, and then he had come back to the covered side and stood over it. And then, without a word about price or purpose, he had cut loose a scrap of the felt with his knife, no bigger than his two hands, worked it between his fingers, folded it once, and carried it away to his rig. He had made Trap no offer. He had asked for no order. He had left with nothing but the scrap and the name of the woman who had made it, and Trap had given him the name because there was no reason on earth not to. Verity heard it out at her own gate, with a cold feeling, moving under the warm one, because she understood at once what it might mean and what it might cost her. A contractor who armored ditches for a living had just carried off a piece of the thing she had spent a spring inventing, and a contractor had a crew and a wagon, and standing with every farmer in 2 counties, everything she did not have, and if he chose to, he could take what she had made and make it himself, blend feather and wool through some mill of his own choosing, and lay it on every ditch in the county under his own name, and she would be back where she started, with a rotting pile and a note and nothing to show for the spring, but the knowledge that she had handed a working man the answer for the price of a knife-cut scrap. She had proven the thing worked so well that a man whose trade it threatened had walked off with it in his pocket. That was the danger of proving a thing past all doubt. Once it could not be doubted, it could be taken. She did not sleep easy for a week over it, and she said nothing of it to Etta. And she went on, cleaning the pile and filling the smaller orders that had begun because Trap's neighbor down the fence line, a man named Merritt Gale, who had watched the ditch hold through the same storms, had asked her for enough of the material to cover a washed bank along his own property line, where the runoff came off the road and ate at his fence posts every wet season. That was a second buyer, come to her not through a millman's mention, but through a farmer's own eyes, one man seeing what had held on another man's ground and wanting it for his own, and she filled Gale's order with a growing understanding that this was how it would move if it moved at all. Not through advertisement or any cleverness of hers, but from held bank to held bank. One skeptic at a time won over by the plain evidence of dirt that stayed where dirt had always washed. Cleaned feather left her farm now in larger sacks than the first experimental load. And finished rolls came back from Ferris's mill ready for more than one property at a time. And on one trip north, she carried material enough for 2 separate jobs in a single wagon, the business growing itself a bank at a time while she waited to learn whether Kettle meant to be a customer or a thief. She learned it on a gray morning in the first true warmth of the years when a rig she did not know turned up the Pigeon Run Road, and Amos Kettle himself climbed down at her gate with clay dried to the knees of his trousers and the flat appraising eyes of a man who had spent his life judging ground and the things done to it. He did not waste her time with pleasantries, which she came in time to understand was simply his way. A man who spent words the way he spent money, carefully and only where they would return him something. "You're the one made what's on Trap's ditch," he said, and it was not quite a question. "Feather and wool, felted," he tells me. "I've been laying stone on cuts like that for 11 years, and I never once thought to lay cloth." He looked past her at the long ridge along the fence, smaller now but still considerable, and something moved behind his eyes she could not yet read. "I carried a piece of it home, and I put it in my own wash race behind the shop, staked it down where the water runs hardest off my roof, and I left it 3 weeks. It held better than it had any business to." He brought his eyes back to her. "I want to know what you'll sell it to me for, by the roll, delivered to my yard, as much of it as that mill will make." The word she had been braced against for a week did not come. He had not come to take it. He had come to buy it, and the cold feeling that had ridden under her ribs since Trap told her of the knife-cut scrap let go all at once. Because a man who had tested a thing 3 weeks in his own wash race and come to buy it by the roll was not a man planning to steal it. He was a man who had done his own proving and decided it was cheaper to buy than to build. But she did not let the relief loosen her tongue, because she had learned that spring what her cleverness had cost her when she gave it away, and she was not going to give this away too. "You could have made it yourself," she said, watching him. "You know how it's made now. Feather and coarse wool through a fulling mill. You've a crew and a wagon and standing with every farmer from here to the county line. What do you want with buying it from me?" Kettle looked at her a moment as though the question had surprised him, and then something that was almost respect came into the flat eyes. "I could make it myself. I thought about making it myself, driving home from Traps with your scrap in my pocket. Then I did the sum." He shifted his weight, a man laying out a reckoning he had already run. "I've got 12 ditches wanting armor this season that I can't get to for the stone hauling. Everyone I do in stone is a week of my crew, and a wagon of quarry rock at quarry prices. Everyone I could do in your cloth is a morning and a stake maul. I'd spend a season and a mill of my own learning to make what you've already learned to make. And by the time I'd learned it, the season be gone and the ditches with it. It's cheaper to buy the cloth off you and spend my crew laying it than to spend my crew making it." He nodded. Once, a man closing his own argument. A man who'd sooner build the thing than buy it, when buying's cheaper, is a man too proud to count. I count. She had not expected to be told the arithmetic of her own advantage so plainly by the man who held the short end of it, and she understood that Kettle was not a generous man but something better for her purposes, a rational one, a man who would deal with her fairly, not out of kindness, but because fair dealing was cheaper for him than the alternative, and a bargain built on a man's own interest was a sturdier thing than one built on his goodwill. She named him a price by the roll, higher than she had charged, Trap, because Trap had been a trial and a beginning, and Kettle was a market. And Kettle did not take it, but he did not laugh at it either. He countered, and they stood at her gate in the gray morning and worked it back and forth, the way 2 people work a price when both mean to reach one, and they reached one. He wanted a first lot delivered to his yard within the fortnight, enough to armor the 3 worst of his waiting ditches, and he put money down against it there at the gate, coin into her hand as a pledge on the order. Near $30 of it. More money at one time than the whole spring had brought her. And he wanted more to follow as fast as she and the mill could make it through the season. She stood at her gate after his rig had gone down the road and looked at the money in her hand, and she did the sum herself, the one that mattered, the note against the orders, $30 down from Kettle and Gale's payment, and traps before it, and the promise of more of Kettle's to follow through the summer, laid against the $240 owed to the bank in Ashfield. Come the fall, and for the first time since she had read the note by lamplight at her kitchen table, the numbers did not fall hopelessly short. They fell short still, but they fell short by a distance she could see across now, a distance she could close if the orders held and the mill kept turning and the summer gave her the days to work, and a gap she could see across was a different thing entirely from a gap that had no far side at all. That was the season she stopped sleeping badly over the note and started sleeping badly over the work, which was a better kind of trouble to lie awake in. The orders came faster than she had hands for. Kettle took his first lot and laid it on his 3 ditches and came back for more before the fortnight was out, because his cloth-laid cuts had held the June storms while his stone was still waiting on the quarry. And every ditch he armored in her material was a ditch a dozen neighbors drove past and asked about, so that the work bred more work the way she had first hoped and hardly dared expect. She was up before the girl now to sort and clean, and down at Ferris's mill 2 and 3 days a week, paying her labor into the working of it, and out on the roads delivering the finished rolls, and the mountain along her fence line shrank through the summer from a ridge that ran the whole length of the western fence to a lesser thing, sorted and bagged at one end for the mill runs to come. The raw remainder still covering a wide stretch of ground where Pike's wagon had first spilled it, but smaller now, visibly smaller, going down load by load into the thing that was saving her. Dell came up the road in the middle of July, and she knew from the set of him before he was off the sorrel that the news had reached him, that the county talk had turned from the widow, playing at ditches to the widow, who had contracted with Amos Kettle, and that it did not sit well with a man who had walked a buyer over her land, expecting to profit from her ruin. He did not dismount this time. He sat the horse in her gateway and looked at the shrunken pile and at the wagon standing loaded for the mill, and the smoothness he had always worn was gone entirely now, worn through to the hard thing that had been under it all along. "So you've got Kettle buying your feathers," he said. No false concern left in it, only the flat resentment of a man watching a plan come apart. Words all over the county. The widow Osgood's in business. He made the word sound like an accusation. You know Coggeshall's had that offer standing since spring. You know he's been patient. A man like that doesn't stay patient forever, and when he stops being patient, he stops being generous. And you'll wish you'd taken the 200 over the note while it was there to take. She set down the roll she had been loading and looked up at him, and she found she was not afraid of him the way she had been in the spring, when his words about the girl's hand in hers had reached in and closed around her heart in the dark. She had money in the strongbox now, and orders in her pocket, and a thing that worked laid on ditches across 2 counties, and a man's threats land differently on a woman who can see across the gap. You brought Coggeshall onto my land to profit off my losing it, she said, and she said it plainly. The thing they had both known since spring and never spoken. There's a finder's fee in a sale like that, isn't there, Dell? Coggeshall clears the note cheap, and you take your cut for delivering him a widow too beaten to hold on. That's what the kindness was. That's what it always was. The color that came up in his face told her she had struck the truth of it, and he did not trouble to deny it, which was its own kind of confession. You'll not hold this place on feathers, he said, the venom in it, the venom of a man whose scheme was slipping. One wet season the cloth fails, one hard winter the orders stop, and you'll be right back where you were. Only a year older and a year deeper, and Coggeshall won't be offering then. I'm giving you your last chance to be smart about it. You gave a stranger a walk over my husband's ground and called it family feeling, she said. And she picked the roll back up and set it in the wagon, turning her back on him to do it, a thing she could not have done in the spring. I'll not take another word of advice from a man who profits when I fail. Get off my brother's horse someday, Dell, and buy your own. Then come tell me how to keep what's mine. She heard the sorrel wheel and heard him ride off without another word, and she did not watch him go this time, because there was work in the wagon and the mill was waiting, and she had learned that the surest answer to a man who wants you ruined is to be in front of him, plainly and visibly not. The summer turned toward its height, and the orders held, and the strong box filled by slow degrees toward the figure that would clear the note. And she began at last to let herself count, not whether she would make it, but by how much. Then, in the first week of August, the thing happened that she had feared all along, without letting herself name it, the thing that could undo a season's work in a single afternoon. Because a business built on a thing holding lives, or dies on the day, the thing does not hold. A writer came up from the south, from a farm past, gales that she had done a job on early. A man named Sowerby, whose long bottom drain she had covered in June, and he came fast and angry with the news that her cloth had failed on his ground, torn out along a whole stretch of his drain in the big storm that had come through 2 nights before, and that he wanted his money back, and meant to tell the county she was selling a thing that would not last. She drove down to Sowerby's the same afternoon, with her heart gone cold and heavy, because a single loud failure could travel faster than a season of quiet successes, and Kettle's whole trade with her rested on the cloth holding, and if it had failed on Sowerby's, it could fail anywhere, and she would lose not one customer, but all of them at once. She found the torn stretch along the bottom drain, and climbed down to it, expecting the worst, expecting to find her material rotted or parted, or simply overmatched, expecting to find that the thing she had built her whole hope on had a flaw in it she had been too green to see. What she found instead, when she got down into the drain and put her hands on the torn ends, and traced the failure back the way she had learned to trace failures, was that the felt had not rotted and had not parted of itself. It had been undercut. Sowerby, or Sowerby's hired man, had staked it shallow and staked it loose along the upper edge, nothing like the close-set staking she had taught herself on Trapp's Bank, and the storm had gotten under the poorly pinned lip, exactly as the water had gotten under her own first careless edge on the home slope in the spring, and once under it had peeled the whole stretch loose from behind. The material had not failed. The setting of it had failed, and it had failed because it had been set by a man in a hurry who had watched her work for an afternoon and thought there was nothing to it. She stood up out of the drain with the torn end in her hand and understood that she was standing at the edge of something more dangerous than a single lost customer, because she could be right about why it failed and still be ruined by it if Sowerby told the county the cloth was no good, and the county believed him. The truth of the staking would never catch up to the story of the failure. She could prove to Sowerby that his own man's shallow stakes had undone it, and Sowerby, having laid the blame on her material in front of his neighbors already, would have every reason to reject the proof, because a man will hold to a story that saves his pride over a truth that costs it. This was the reversal she had not foreseen, that her material could be undone not by its own weakness, but by the carelessness of the men who laid it, and that every job done by a hand other than hers was a job that could fail in her name for reasons that were not her fault and would ruin her all the same. Sowerby stood on the bank above her with his arms crossed and his mind made up, a lean, sour man who had wanted a bargain and gotten one and was now angry that a bargain had needed care. "Don't tell me it's the staking," he said before she had opened her mouth, because he had seen the thought forming in her. "You sold me a thing that don't hold. I laid it same as you'd have laid it. You laid it shallow along the top and you know it," she said, holding up the torn end so the short-driven stake still hanging in, it showed plain. And it peeled from the top the way anything peels that's not pinned to hold the top edge down. The cloth's not torn across, Mr. Sowerby. It's not rotted. It's whole. It came loose because the water got under a loose edge, same as it'd get under a shingle laid loose, and pulled it back from behind. She climbed up the bank to stand level with him, because a thing like this could not be argued from below. I'll not give you your money back for a job your own man undid. But I'll do this. I'll restake this whole run myself, close and deep the way it wants doing, at no charge to you but the cost of the stakes, and I'll stand behind it through the next storm and the one after. If it fails again when it's set right, then you'll have your money and your story both. That's fair. And you know it's fair, and the only thing standing against it is that you've already told your neighbors it was the cloth. It was the last of it that reached him. Because she had named the thing he was really defending, which was not his money but his having already spoken, and she had offered him a way to save the money and the face, both by letting her set it right rather than admitting he had said it wrong. He chewed on it a long moment, and the anger went out of him by degrees, replaced by the grudging calculation of a man who sees that the offered way costs him less than the way he had chosen. "Restake it," he said finally, "and if it holds the next 2 storms, I'll tell them it holds. But if it goes again when I've said it, I'll say so myself. In town to whoever you like," she said, and she meant it, because she had understood something standing in his drain that was worth more than the one job. A thing that only works when I said it isn't a thing I've made, it's a thing I am, and I'll be dead of it inside 2 years. She restaked Sowerby's drain herself that same week, close and deep, the way it wanted, and she drove home, turning over the harder problem it had shown her, which was that she could not stake every ditch in 2 counties with her own 2 hands. That the business would strangle in her own grip if every job depended on her setting it, and that if the material was to be anything larger than herself, she would have to find a way to make the setting of it as sure as the making of it, so that a man in a hurry could not undo in an afternoon what the mill had taken a week to build. The answer, when it came from the same place her answers always came, which was from looking hard at what had already gone wrong instead of wishing it had not. Every failure she had seen, her own first lifted edge on the home slope, the tear out below Trapp's culvert, the peeling of Sowerby's shallow-staked run, had failed at an edge and failed from the top, the water getting under a lip that was not held and working backward from there. The cloth in the middle never failed. It was always the edges. So the thing to fix was not the cloth but the edge. And she began to work out, through the back half of the summer, a way of finishing the upper edge of every run, so that it could not be laid wrong, a way of turning the top edge under and pinning it in a shallow trench so that the water ran over a buried lip instead of catching under a loose one. And once she had worked it out on her own slopes, she made it a rule of every job, a thing she showed each buyer and each buyer's hired man, and would not sell the cloth without, that the top edge went in a trench, or she did not warrant it to hold. It slowed the laying. It cost a little more labor. But it took the failure out of the hands of the men in a hurry, and a business that could survive a careless hired man was a business that could grow past the reach of her own 2 arms, which was the only kind of business that would still be standing when the note came due and after. Kettle, when she showed him the buried edge, saw the sense of it at once, because Kettle saw the sense of anything that saved him a failure. And he took it into his own crew's practice without argument, and the county talk that might have turned on Sowerby's torn drain turned instead, as the summer went on and the restaked run held storm after storm, into talk of a widow who stood behind her work and came herself to set right what a careless hand had spoiled, which was worth more to her in the end than if the drain had never failed at all. A failure met square and mended in the open built her more trust than an unbroken record ever could have. Because the county had watched her be tested and had watched her stand, and a countryside that has watched you stand will forgive you a great deal. and buy from you for years. By the middle of September, she had it counted and recounted and was sure of it, the strong box against the note, and she had enough. She had laid by from Kettle's steady orders and traps and gales and the dozen smaller jobs the summer had bred. The whole $240 the bank was owed, with a margin over it that would carry her and the girl through the winter and buy the next season's steaks besides. She could have driven to Ashfield the day she was sure and cleared it. She waited instead until the week the note fell due, deliberately, because she wanted no question of it, no room for the bank, or for Dell, or for Coggeshall behind him to say the money had come a day too late, or $1 too short. And she admitted to herself on the drive in, to pay it not early, and grateful, but exactly on the day, and to the penny, a woman meeting an obligation on her own terms, and not a beggar rushing to be free of it. She drove to Ashfield on a bright cold morning at the very end of the season, with the money, counted twice, in a cloth bag in her coat and Etta on the seat beside her. Because she wanted the girl to see it done. To carry the memory of the day the place was made theirs for good, and not the memory of the spring it was nearly lost. The bank was a low brick building on the town's one-brick street, and she went in and laid the money on the counter and named the note against the Osgood farm, and the clerk counted it again, and made out the paper that said the debt was cleared, and the land was hers free of any lien. And she folded that paper away with more care than she had ever folded money, because money could be spent, and this could not. This was the ground under her daughter's feet, made certain, and she had bought it, with a mountain of garbage a man had dumped on her fence to shame her. Coggeshall was in the bank when she paid it. As it happened, a heavy, prosperous man in a good coat come in on business of his own, and he saw the note cleared and understood at once what it meant. That the ground he had been promised was not coming to him, that the patient waiting was done and had come to nothing. He looked at her across the small room with the frank displeasure of a man kept from a thing he had counted as good as his, and the business ends. He did a thing she had not expected, which was to cross the room and offer her his hand, because he was a businessman before he was a disappointed one. And a businessman knows when a thing is finished. "You held it," he said, no warmth in it but a kind of professional acknowledgement, one dealer recognizing another. "Dell told me you'd not last the summer. I'd have had this place for the note and a little over." He looked at her with a reassessing eye. "That cloth of yours. If you ever want to partner with capital, to make it at scale, to build you a mill of your own and put it on every ditch in the state, you come to me before you go to anyone. There's more money in it than you're making a roll at a time off farmers' ditches." She took his hand because there was no reason not to, and she heard the offer for what it was, which was the same hunger that had sent him walking over her bottomland in the spring, only turned now toward the thing she had made, instead of the thing she stood to lose. "I'll remember you offered," she said, and she did not say yes and did not say no, because she had learned that season the cost of letting a hungry man near a thing you had made, and she was not going to hand what she had built to the very man who had waited all summer to take her land for a debt. She had a millman she trusted in Anson Ferris, and a market she had made herself in Kettle and the farmers. And if the thing was to grow to a mill of its own someday, it would grow on her terms from the ground she had held, and not on the capital of a man who had bet against her holding it. She walked out of the bank into the bright autumn street, with the cleared note folded in her coat and her daughter's hand in hers, the hand Dell had used against her in the spring, whole and warm, and holding the hand of a mother who had a roof over it that no man could take. And she stood a moment on the brick street in the cold sunlight and let herself feel the size of what the day had made certain before she turned the mare toward home. The pile that had been a mountain was a low remnant now against her fence, and it would be gone entirely by the spring, gone into the ditches of 2 counties, and where it had been there would be only fence and grass, and the memory, growing fainter every season, of the morning a man had backed a wagon up to her line and dumped his garbage on a widow he thought too small to do anything but suffer it. She had done more than suffer it. She had made it the thing that saved her. And there was a justice in that quieter and more complete than any revenge she could have taken. Because the men who had laughed on the back of that wagon would drive past her fence for years and see grass where the mountain had been, and never once know that the thing they had dumped to shame her was the thing that had made her a business and held her land and put shoes on her daughter for the winter. On the drive home, she turned off the Pigeon Run road at the raw slope above the run where she had staked the first mill-made piece in the spring. The test that had first told her the cloth would hold against weather, and she stopped the wagon to look at it, because she had not been down to it in weeks. The felt lay there still against the ground where she had pinned it, weathered gray to the color of the earth around it, and the slope that had lost its soil every wet season for as long as she had farmed it was whole, not a gully cut in it, held firm under the skin she had laid across it. And pushing up through the matted fiber, thin and green and improbable in the September light, a fine growth of young grass had taken root in the held soil beneath and come up through, felt itself, the cloth that had saved the ground. Now giving way to the ground it had saved, the dead feathers a man had thrown away, become the cradle of something living rooting down into earth that would have washed to the creek without them. She sat on the wagon seat with Etta beside her and looked at the green coming up through the gray. And she did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. And after a while she clucked to the mare and drove the rest of the way home, where the last of the mountain waited to be made into the thing that held the world in place.